It's impossible to exaggerate how much it matters, never to let go of, in the manner of a dog with a bone, far less to forget what's been done to us and by whom. Part of the would-be totalitarian's grasp for control depends on never giving an inch, never backing down, never admitting mistakes or wrongdoing. Because in their heads, they don't make mistakes and they don't do wrong. The leash, once pulled shorter, is never willingly released. It remains shortened. This is a headline in The Defender, which is a news outlet on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s website, Children's Health Defence. Taxpayers stuck with $15 million tab to protect Fauci after he retired. Anthony Fauci. Up until at least late September, an agreement between two government agencies has left the American taxpayer on the hook for the costs attached to Fauci's lifestyle, which included a publicly funded chauffeur and fully staffed US Marshals security detail. It goes on, the contract could be extended and it's unknown if it has been. The former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, that's the NIAID, who retired in December 2022, was one of the most influential figures in America throughout the world during the coronavirus era. Ain't that the truth? Fauci postured and presented as a little king on a throne, monarch of all he surveyed. To go back to the article, nearly ubiquitous on cable and broadcast news, Fauci became the face of America's pandemic response. His supporters often spoke of him as a man of uncontested knowledge, consistently labelling him the world's foremost public health expert. But his detractors recall a government official who led the fight to implement years-long draconian restrictions upon the American people, which devastated the fabric of US society, greatly harmed the economy, and caused all kinds of additional negative repercussions, including widespread learning loss among America's youth. Fauci was never shy to advocate for lockdowns, social distancing, school closures, business closures, mask mandates, and vaccine passports from his powerful federal perch during the COVID-19 pandemic. From 2019 to 2022, he was the highest paid federal employee, and he received lucrative cash prizes from domestic and international organisations that sought to position themselves closely with the man who controlled the distribution of billions of dollars in grant-making funds. Fauci retired from the federal bureaucracy with a record $480,654 salary. In 2022, open the books estimated his pension would be about $355,000 per year, adding to the considerable fortune of $11 million amassed over his 54 years of government service. The President of the US makes $400,000 per year. I say this is yet another example of those responsible for, at best, serial incompetence, or at worst, and much more likely in my opinion, an egregious campaign of lying and obfuscation in pursuit of obscene profits. Not just getting away with what, it might be argued, amount to crimes against humanity, not just getting away with those crimes, but being awarded iconic status for actions taken. Robert Kennedy Jr. has for years been asking questions about the vaccines mandated for American infants and children. In relatively recent times, he's been able to get a wider audience to listen to his experiences. Have a listen to this.
For many years, I was saying not one of the 72 vaccines mandated for children has ever been safety tested in pre-licensing placebo-controlled trials, not one. Tony Fauci was saying he's lying.
I don't have it, it's back at Bethesda. He'd accused Bobby Kennedy Jr. of lying, and then when put on the spot and asked to produce that documentation, he came away with "the dog ate my homework" school of excuses. Now, listen again.
In 2016, President Trump appointed me to run a vaccine safety commission, and he ordered Fauci and Collins to meet with me with White House counsel, present. And I said to Fauci at that meeting, "You say I'm lying. For 8 years, you've been saying I'm lying about this. Show me this study." And he said, I don't have it here. is back in Bethesda.
That's extraordinary. That's from the beginning. Fauci knowing that he didn't have that research, he didn't have that paperwork, because it had never been commissioned. And all he did was try and hold Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at bay in hopes that he would go away. This is the behaviour by the figure who was lionized as, trust me, I am the science, Anthony Fauci. There's more, though.
And I'll send it to you. I never got it. So I sued him. Me and Aaron Siri, and after stonewalling us for a year, their lawyers met us on the courthouse steps and said, yep, you're right. We never had any study.
That has to be the most dreamlike business model of all time. You come up with something, it gets mandated, which means you don't have to try and sell it to anyone because it's mandated. It has to go into the bodies of every school child in America. And so it goes on.
And they gave it to us in writing. You can go to the CHD website, my website, and you can see that letter from HHS. There's no downstream liability. There's no front-end safety testing. That saves them $250 million. And there's no marketing and advertising costs because the federal government is ordering them ordering 78 million school kids to take that vaccine every year. What better product could you have?
This is the most extraordinary testimony. And Robert Kennedy Jr. has been banging on about this. He's been telling people, anyone who would listen to this, for years. And his testimony of this sort goes on and on. It's a bottomless pit of revelation of shamelessly corrupt behaviour on the part of others. Here in the UK, the number of children being diagnosed with those same conditions, which is to say autism, ADHD, ADD, and the rest, it's been on the increase for years. I'm younger than Kennedy Jr., but like him, I grew up really never having heard of these conditions. I never saw any of it when I was at school. I didn't really know about autism at all until I saw Dustin Hoffman play the part of Rain Man at the movies. It was unheard of, more or less, in Robert Kennedy's generation. I mean, 1 in 10,000 is basically, you're not going to see it. And now there's an incidence of autism of 1 in 30. 1 in 30 in American schools. And I've seen lower. Sometimes it goes down to 1 in every 22 kids. The British experience of childhood vaccination has been different than the American. That much is true, at least in relation to the number of jabs given to infants and children in their early years. But during the COVID debacle, millions of people of all ages in the UK experienced at first hand the dangers that can be consequences of the latest so-called vaccine product, dangers that we're still bullied into overlooking. The number of adverse reactions resultant from the COVID jabs amounted to a greater number of harms than those resultant from all other vaccines for everything put together. And so those so-called COVID vaccines are still being offered, and billions of pounds and dollars are being invested to develop and make more of the same. Nothing changes. No lessons are learned. Remember what Kennedy said about the situation in the United States, where vaccine companies cannot be sued. They can't be sued. Imagine lining up to take a jab of anything from companies that have already been convicted of harm for drugs they've developed and pushed onto the market. Companies that have already been fined billions of dollars for harms caused and for general wrongdoing. Imagine living in a world in which that behaviour is pushed as normal, where companies with those kinds of track records stay in business. But we don't have to imagine, because that's still where we are. In the UK, instead of Anthony Fauci, we had to listen to the likes of Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty, both of whom pushed the same misinformation about safety and efficacy, and both of whom have been honoured for their parts in it all. Professor Sarah Gilbert, co-creator of the Oxford AstraZeneca jab, the one subsequently withdrawn from use. She was given a damehood. Over and over, were made to witness those who participated being rewarded one way or another. And so, Dr. Anthony Fauci has been and may still be costing the US taxpayer millions of dollars a year for his protection, for his chauffeur, for his lifestyle, in retirement. And yet, Robert Kennedy Jr. was, over and again, despite requests, denied taxpayer-funded protection, even in the face of multiple death threats while he was on the campaign trail. And let's remember that the US president shot in 1963 and the presidential candidate shot in 1968 were both Kennedys. So it's not like Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s fears of assassination are credibly to be dismissed as groundless. Only for a short while after one of the attempted assassinations of Donald Trump was Robert Kennedy given that protection. And it was withdrawn again the moment he dropped out of the presidential race. I say, and I've said it before, that this is all part of sending the same message, that those who pushed the jabs, pushed the lockdowns, pushed the masks, and the rest of the COVID con, those that were part of the big pharma money train that coins in the billions of dollars and pounds, the money train filling the war chest that powers the lobbying, that ensures the money train keeps running faster and faster, are lionised and honoured in every conceivable way.
And so there was a gold rush to add all these new vaccines to the schedule that we don't need. Most of these vaccines are unnecessary. Many of them are for diseases that are not even casually contagious. It was a gold rush, because if you get onto that schedule, the recommended schedule, it's $1 billion a year for your company. And in many cases, NIH is bearing the royalties. So we got all of these new vaccines, 72 shots, 16 vaccines, and now even more because we're doing the HPV vaccine. And that year, 1989, we saw an explosion in chronic disease in American children. The neurological diseases suddenly exploded in 1989. ADD, ADHD, sleep disorders, language delays, ASD, autism, Tourette syndrome, tics, narcolepsy. These are all things that I never heard of. Autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation, according to the CDC data, to 1 in every 34 kids today.
Let's say he's right, but it's there or thereabouts. $79 billion in penalties. That's the money that they pay out after being convicted of wrongdoing. And it doesn't matter to them because the profits that they make ensure that billion-dollar penalties are chump change that they can well afford. But the predicament of the American people in relation to big pharma and vaccine companies gets worse.
The pharmaceutical industry is not a trustworthy industry. It's a criminal cartel.
How can that be? How can that be that they are immune from liability? They're tasked with making products that are mandated to go into people's bodies. And if anything goes wrong, it's not their problem.
And I don't say that lightly. The 4 companies that make all of the vaccines, the 72 vaccines now mandated for our children, all of them in their other products have paid, I think, $79 billion.
And that's the reality. Since the 80s, that's been the reality. For the longest time, RFK Jr. was on the outside, pushing against a locked and barred door. Now, potentially, if Donald Trump actually makes it into office in January, and as they say, there's many a slip twixt cup and lip, he and others like-minded would be on the inside. At that point, again, potentially, all sorts of money-making scams and rackets on a global scale and of incalculable worth to those benefiting from them directly or indirectly are hypothetically vulnerable to being exposed and cancelled. Can you imagine? I don't think it's possible to stress how big this is. It's like It's like Schrodinger's presidency. At the moment, until Donald Trump actually takes office in January, anything and nothing could happen. We'll just have to wait and see when the box is opened. I don't think it's possible to stress how big this is, how volatile, how dangerous it is for those proposing to get in the way of the money train. A money train that's been full steam ahead for decades. Big Pharma being a huge part of it, the military-industrial complex being another, even bigger racket. That's another story. How much of the US economy, though, depends on warfare, forever war, to make ends meet? How many people's luxurious lifestyles are dependent on the profits of Big Pharma or Big Food and all its ultra-processed toxins? And already Donald Trump and RFK Jr. and the rest are making noises about putting the brakes on all of it. What happens then? What fills the coppers next? I don't know. I tell you what, as far as I'm concerned, it's way past time, just for starters, once and for all, to drop the anti-vax slur. Anti-vaxxers, remember that? For all sorts of reasons beyond the exposure of the truth of the harms done during the COVID era. If you haven't yet reached the point where you want questions asked and answered about the related substances routinely injected into the bodies of children and adults, then I say you might be beyond help. RFK Jr. campaigned, so to speak, on the promise to make America healthy again. One way or another, on account of Big Pharma, Big Food, the health of Americans is through the floor and falling. Casey Means, an outspoken American physician, most recently part of the Trump-Kennedy push for better health, has observed over and over that there's no more valuable commodity in the US than a sick kid, made and kept sick by ultra-processed food and pumped full of whatever Big Pharma dreams up and has mandated by the US government. What I would describe as America's insane policy of pushing so many vaccine and other products into American children in the face of mounting evidence about harms done should be an example growing radioactively hot of what not to do. We need a serious, critically serious conversation about what's being done to children's health and well-being and why. And we can't have that conversation while the powers that ought not to be are still doing everything in their power to silence one side of that conversation. The evidence is clear and explicit all over. Harms done by Big Pharma, lies told by Big Pharma, evidence ignored and suppressed by Big Pharma. The likes of Fauci and his ilk are not just left free to walk the streets, they might as well be being carried shoulder high and or rewarded with all the best society can provide. If you still think you live in a society where it's the truthful that are rewarded, think again.